China asserts itself as a peace broker of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Syria is readmitted to the Arab League after a 12-year isolation, and a Colorado teachers union says that capitalism exploits children. This is the noteworthy news that you need to know for today, Monday, May 8th, 2023. But first, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below to stay tuned to this channel. And also, I have to say before we dive into news, wasn't that coronation so beautiful? Didn't Kate Middleton and Princess Charlotte look like, oh, I don't know, princesses? Don't you think, Sean? I'm sure Sean watched the whole thing. For those of you who didn't check out my coronation episode on my show Timeless, be sure to check it out. And for those of you who didn't watch the coronation this past weekend, what did you do? This is a really big event. Okay, just had to say that at the outset. But now on to the first news story of the day. Actually, I want to tell you that I'm going to talk about two international news stories first, as you know from the introduction. And you probably heard China and Syria, and you're thinking, what do those two have to do with the United States? Well, a lot, actually. The theme of these two stories is that the United States is shrinking hugely and rapidly in our global power. You know, the President of the United States is often blamed for sort of almost everything that goes wrong in the country. It's very common to hear people say, well, there were X amount of shootings in major cities under X person's presidency, or test scores fell this amount during that individual's presidency. In other words, again, the president gets blamed for sort of everything. But this isn't always, of course, fair to blame the president for everything that goes wrong, with one exception: foreign policy. That is the one area where you really can blame the president if something goes wrong, because out of the, I believe, 7 constitutional powers of a president that are outlined in the Constitution, I think 5 of them pertain to foreign policy powers. That is, to sign treaties with other countries, to regulate and command the army, and of course, to be the representative on the global stage with other countries. So with all that's going on right now in our foreign policy, it really can be chalked up to the poor example set by President Biden. I will say, though, that sometimes presidents do inherit something that is very unfortunate. Maybe their predecessor got us into an ill-advised war, or some tragedy happened and the next president has to sort of carry the baton and deal with it. But this was not so for President Biden. We, the United States, established a sterling international reputation under President Trump. Whether you like him or dislike him, I think we can all agree that one of his greatest strong suits as president was international relations. If you look at the Middle East, President Trump signed the Abraham Accords, which were huge in brokering and establishing diplomatic relations between Israel and other neighboring Arab states such as Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They established defense relations. They opened the airspace to planes, Israeli planes, to fly in Arab countries' airspace. Also, it just overall allowed certain Arab countries to start to see Israel as a legitimate, dare I even say friendly, partner in the Middle East. I have a friend in Australia who jokes that Australians are the biggest beneficiaries of the Abraham Accords because they can fly from Sydney to Tel Aviv instead of having to stop in Dubai. Anyway, that is one example of a huge push forward that happened under President Trump. I'll give a second one. He eliminated ISIS within just about 10 months of his presidency. He was sworn into office on January 20th, 2017. By the end of that year, 2017, 95% of the territory that ISIS held was no longer in ISIS's hands. This is thanks to President Trump's very targeted and effective drone strikes. President Trump was also quite strong with Russia. He was the first president in the 21st century that did not see Russia invade a neighboring country or area under his tenure. Under President Bush, Putin invaded the neighboring country of Georgia. Under President Obama, Putin invaded Crimea. And then, of course, under President Trump, Putin invaded the entirety of Ukraine. That's with regard to the Middle East and with Russia. Also, President Trump was great as far as establishing us as an oil-independent country so that we did not entreat to our adversaries like Saudi Arabia and the Venezuelans for our oil. And crucially, and this is what's segueing me into the first news story, President Trump was very strong with regard to China. He slapped tariffs on Chinese goods in order to punish them for unfair trade practices. He imposed penalties such as travel restrictions and freezing the property in the United States of those Chinese individuals who are the most responsible for the Uyghur massacre. And of course, President Trump very famously sent aircraft carriers to conduct joint naval exercises over the South China Sea when Xi Jinping and the Chinese Navy were encroaching into Taiwanese territory. And of course, President Trump, unlike President Biden, is not and was not bribed by Chinese officials. This all changed so quickly when President Biden came into office. Within just a few months, he pulled us out of Afghanistan, which was a disaster. It created the transferring of $85 billion in U.S. weaponry, which was once in the hands of the Afghans that we are supporting, now in the hands of the Taliban. Of course, as I said just a few moments ago, Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Not a coincidence that he waited until President Biden was in office. President Biden entreated to the Saudis and Venezuelans for our oil because he didn't want to tick off the environmentalists here by drilling. And of course, again, this segue into the first news story, President Biden has been very soft on China. So now we are seeing that the West is considering having China broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine in order to end the conflict, after previously asserting that Beijing's support for Russia would make them an untenable negotiating power. Both American and European officials are now expressing a willingness to allow China to broker this peace deal. Some of the officials include our own Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, as well as officials from our U.S. National Security Council. According to the Wall Street Journal, these individuals, quote, have expressed cautious optimism recently that Beijing could help diffuse the conflict. European leaders, such as the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, are hopping on board. Of course, officials in Paris and Berlin are also saying that they are interested in perhaps having China negotiate a peace deal. This makes more sense because European countries are more heavily bearing the brunt of the war amid Western sanctions on Russian oil and gas. Most European countries rely heavily on Russia for those resources, that is oil and gas. So it makes sense that they are sort of more willing to have China negotiate a peace deal. But this is a pretty stunning turnaround with regard to U.S. relations, expressing an openness here. Now, Xi Jinping, back in February of this year, presented a 12-point plan to the Biden administration in order to end the war in Ukraine. But the U.S. rejected it, saying that it was too accommodating to Russia's interest. But nevertheless, Xi Jinping has persisted. Of course, he visited Moscow in March, famously meeting with President Putin. They called each other dear friends and affirmed a strong relationship between the two countries, that is China and Russia. Xi Jinping also called the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, last month, establishing relations with him and a willingness to broker this peace deal. And Beijing announced just a few days ago that they are going to be sending an envoy of diplomatic officials to Kiev to try to arrange this ceasefire. Even President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has been more receptive to China's influence here. Earlier this year, President Macron of France actually offered to meet in private with President Zelensky in order to talk about the end of the war in Ukraine. And President Zelensky said that he would not meet with him, that is the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, unless President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping of China were present at that meeting. That is pretty amazing that even Zelensky requested the presence of China. It shows that he knows that China is increasingly becoming a hegemonic, influential power with regard to international relations. So the point is here, the United States has usually been the power that is in charge of brokering peace deals between countries. We have seen this for the entirety of our history. If you look at our recent history, we brokered peace deals between the countries of the former Yugoslavian constituents. We also, of course, have brokered several peace deals between Israel and the surrounding countries, most recently, of course, with the Abraham Accords. We facilitated the end of the Cold War. The United States has always been that power that other countries have gone to in order to help negotiate peace deals. And now we are seeing China take our place. Not only are we seeing China take our place, but we are readily allowing it. This is what I was saying earlier with how quickly our international situation has changed from President Trump to President Biden. Our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, at a Washington Post forum just a few days ago, said, in principle, there's nothing wrong with China negotiating a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. He said that if there are countries with significant influence that are prepared to pursue a just and durable peace, this is the words of the Secretary of State, we would welcome that. And it's certainly possible that China would have a role to play in that effort. Now, of course, Secretary Blinken makes a good point. In principle, there's nothing wrong with China brokering this peace deal if it leads to a peace. The problem is China is not going to broker a peace deal that is fair to the side of Ukraine. And also, again, China should not be the one doing it. The United States should go, wait a minute, we don't want our adversary to take our place as the broker of peace deals. We should be maintaining that space. So what has President Biden done on the world stage in recent months? Well, he did meet with President Xi of China in Indonesia back in November. So how many months ago was that? Over 6 months ago during the G20 summit. They just happened to both be in that country, so they met, but there was no official state visit. Of course, President Biden did go to Ukraine on the 1-year anniversary. I hate saying anniversary because anniversary to me sounds like a celebratory event. On the 1-year mark of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he visited Kiev in a clandestine arrangement that ultimately, of course, was publicized. But in the month of April, guess who the two leaders President Biden met with were? The president of South Korea and the president of Ireland. Okay, that sounds great, but really? Are South Korea and Ireland in the news on a daily basis? Shouldn't our president be, again, in the forefront, talking with Putin, talking with Zelensky, talking with Xi Jinping? But instead he's going to Ireland? Really? Again, this is not good. We are supposed to be the ones at the forefront here. Now, the second news story that I'm telling you about, this fact that Syria was voted into the Arab League, fits in this same theme. We should not be allowing this to happen. We should be more managing what is going on the world stage. This past weekend, there was an emergency meeting in Cairo, Egypt, where the Arab League voted to readmit Syria as one of its members after a 12-year isolation period back in 2011 when they kicked Syria out of the Arab League at the start of the Syrian civil war. The Arab League is a group of 22, you guessed it, Arab nations. The group was founded after World War II in 1945 in order to coordinate on regional matters among these Arab countries in the Middle East. And mainly, of course, it was sort of established to create unity in the Middle East and to counter the United States' hegemonic influence on the world stage. Now, in the past few decades, the Arab League has been plagued by conflict, namely because of the Sunni-Shia divide. Most Muslims are Sunni, about 90%, whereas only about 10% are Shias. Accordingly, most Arab countries in the Middle East are majority Sunni. The two exceptions are Syria and Iran. Maybe Azerbaijan too is Sunni, Shia. My dear producer Sean will have to look that up for me. Iraq also has a majority Shia population, though for most of its history it was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni. But the point is, the Arab League has been plagued by this Sunni-Shia divide, and we are now seeing that become reversed, with allowing Syria, a Shia-led country, to come back into the Arab League. So as I mentioned, Syria has been out of the Arab League for 12 years. This dates back to 2011 when the Syrian civil war started. The Syrian civil war started in 2011 because of something that we have all heard of called the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a really sort of global movement of uprisings among Arab populations in their respective countries against their dictatorial, tyrannical governments. Actually, the Arab Spring, if you really want to go back, many say was kicked off by President Obama, who traveled to Cairo and gave a speech about the importance of democracy in the Middle East. And he sort of insinuated in that speech that people should rise up. Actually, maybe he didn't even insinuate it. I think he was actually overt about it, about how the people should rise up and that the United States would be a supporter of those individuals who resisted their governments. This was a very inspiring speech. Many did rise up in their respective countries, but the United States did not support them, and bloodshed and civil war and havoc ensued, most especially in Syria, when rebels rebelled against the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, who is Alawite. Alawite is a sect of Shia Islam. So then there was this sort of divide in Syria where Iran, a Shia country, was supporting Bashar al-Assad as a Shia leader. Iran was supporting the government of Syria, whereas Sunni countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia were supporting the rebels, those who were resisting the government of Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad famously used chemical weapons against his own people in order to suppress the Syrian civil war. It created an awful refugee crisis all throughout the Middle East that bled into European countries. So as a result, Syria was kicked out of the Arab League. But this past weekend, Arab leaders voted to readmit Syria. Many of them expressed that they were still wary of Bashar al-Assad, but nevertheless, this is a key point here. They said that disunity in the Middle East has harmed each country in its relations with one another, and that even though many of these Arab nations dislike Assad and dislike Syria and Iran's influence, they are moving towards having this sort of pan-Arab unity in the face of Western power. Arab League ministers expressed, quote, a keenness to launch a leading Arab role in efforts to resolve the Syria crisis and agreed to maintain, quote, a direct dialogue with the Syrian government in order to reach a comprehensive solution. So again, you are probably wondering, this may be okay, but what does this have to do with the United States? Again, this has to do with the fact that China is sort of pulling the strings to make this coming together, this unity in the Middle East possible, and the United States is letting it happen. It is indeed not benefiting from it. The reason why I say China is pulling the strings is that just a few months ago, China brokered a historic peace deal between Saudi Arabia, a Sunni country, and Iran, a Shia country. Saudi Arabia and Iran hated each other. The head, or I think it was Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, called the head of Iran, President Ibrahim Raisi, a Nazi. So no bueno, the relations between them. But China comes in, senses an opportunity to pit powers against the West, and so brokers this historic peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Once Saudi Arabia and Iran became friends, then it opened the door for Saudi Arabia and Hamas to become friends. Again, they were bitter enemies. That opened the door for Saudi Arabia and Syria to become friends. Also, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, also alongside Saudi Arabia in recent months, thanks to China, have reestablished diplomatic ties with Syria, which culminated in this bringing them back into the Arab League. Where is President Biden with all of this? Again, he's meeting with the president of South Korea. He's going to Ireland. Is that really what matters right now? We certainly, in American international relations, we have gotten in trouble for butting in. We have seen the consequences in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And I think there's a part of us that is afraid to sort of get involved in international conflicts or in international relations. But what we are seeing here right now is also the danger in militantly staying out. It is advantageous for us to divide our enemies. We used to benefit from this Sunni-Shia divide. But now that these countries are coming together, thanks to China, it can only hurt us, because then they can collude with regard to oil prices. They can certainly come together and try to oppress Israel. And this was reversing a trend of Israel becoming closer to these Sunni countries. So our absence, i.e. President Biden's absence, is creating a rapidly deteriorating international system for the United States. Now, on to our final news story of domestic news. A Colorado teachers union with over 39,000 education workers in its group has released a resolution, or I guess passed a resolution, saying that capitalism exploits children. This was recently passed at the Chicago Education Association, that's the name of the teachers unions, the CEA's 2023 Delegate Assembly. Here is a final version of the resolution, a quote from the final resolution. Oh, did I say Chicago? I'm so sorry. This is why I keep Sean around. Colorado, thank you, teachers union. The CEA believes, this is a quote, that capitalism requires exploitation of children, public schools, land, labor, and or resources. Capitalism is in opposition to fully addressing systemic racism, the school-to-prison pipeline, that's what they put in parentheses, climate change, patriarchy, gender and LGBTQ disparities, education inequality, and income inequality. Now, according to Fox News, an earlier draft of this resolution did call for, quote, a new equitable economic system to replace capitalism, but the final resolution that was passed did not include this phrase. So, to state the obvious, this is what is going on with our public schools. They are teaching children that capitalism is this horrible, rotten thing. What's really more startling to me than that, of course, that is both untrue and just not really the place of schools to teach, is the fact that the Colorado Teachers Union is focusing on capitalism and not the fact that test scores across the country have been rapidly deteriorating, in large part due to the pandemic. I talked about this on Julie Noted last week. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is also known as the nation's report card, only 13% of 8th graders in the United States in public schools met proficiency standards for U.S. history. That requires identifying certain individuals, certain themes, certain events, periods of history. Only 13% of 8th graders could meet those standards. Less than 20% of American public school 8th graders scored at proficiency levels in civics. In 2022, 8th graders scored 5 points lower in American history compared with 2018, okay? That's civics and American history. Let's go on to math. These were federal test results that were released back in October of 2022, which said that there was the largest drop in math scores ever in U.S. history, and also a nationwide drop in reading that reversed 30 years of gains. In 2022, the average math scores for 8th graders dropped from 8 points from 2019, and in 2022, the average reading scores fell by 3 points compared to 2019. So this Colorado Teachers Union example, this crazy thing that capitalism exploits everything under the sun. You read, or you listened to the laundry list that I read. We think that this wokeism, there's this sort of prevailing notion that this wokeism is just confined to a few crazy educators in affluent liberal parts of the country. No, I am providing you with these examples because we all have to know this stuff cold. We have to be able to put it in our arsenal and use this in debates with everyday people who think that this is just a fringe movement. This is the Colorado Teachers Union. 39,000 educators are now having a resolution that will inform the way that they teach their students that capitalism harms everyday people. I always talk about this resolution that was passed by the Oregon Department of Education a year and a half ago, saying that finding one right answer in math is white supremacy. That's another example. This is not fringe. This is the Oregon Department of Education. New Jersey's Department of Education has all of these crazy rules about how gender is non-binary. There's no such thing as men and women, that they make students as young as 10 years old learn in certain schools. And the New Jersey Department of Education has said that teachers in school districts that do not follow and teach these gender codes will be punished. LAUSD right here in California has 450 schools under its jurisdiction, and once a month at LAUSD schools, they have Rainbow Club meetings for students as young as 4 years old, where they have drag queen story hours and they learn all of those oppressive things about how sex is apparently non-binary. So it's just astounding to see how much this has infected the United States. And again, you know, I was talking about how the first two stories sort of explain our diminishing global power. This domestic story may seem like it's in another category, but it actually falls under the same thing. Do you think China is teaching its students that there is no such thing as two genders? Do you think China is teaching its students that finding one right answer in math is white supremacy? No. China has a very strong, robust education system. Its citizens, even its most low-income citizens, are remarkably technically trained. All of this fits together. It's not just that we are not asserting ourselves properly on the world stage, but we are actively creating a citizenry that is not up to the challenges posed by our time. On that happy note, thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to check out my show Timeless, where I talk about timeless, eternal subjects on the playlist here on this page. And also just a reminder to please subscribe to this channel so I can keep doing what I do. See you all soon. Take care.